Well, I joined what was then the newspaper marketing agency, the NMA, in January 2012 with a remit to change it. That's what I like doing. I enjoy taking an organisation and breathing new life into it and making it as appropriate and as effective as it can be in the circumstances and climate and age in which it finds itself. And very often with organisations, as things move on, they fail to keep up with some of the changes, in particular the mission for the NMA on the board. And it was my job really to agree a new set of objectives and to clarify the vision for the future. And as part of that, one of the things that I recommended was a change in the management structure, a change in the mission of what we were there to do, a change in the way that we were assessed, and therefore a change in our activities and a change in our name and our branding. So I regarded the change in our name not as a superficial add-on, but as a symbol of all the other changes that were taking place.
And that's quite interesting, because that brings me into one of the questions about there is this outward face of change. It's in the website seminar yesterday morning. But I'm guessing there were things that were important to hold on to.
Yes. I mean, I think it's always important when you go into an organisation to look at what it is that's doing well and what is valued within the organisation, as well as the things that you can change and develop. And then there will be some things that you decide you need to lose. And the NMA had a very good reputation for robust and thorough research. And it was respected for that. And that's something that we have been determined to hang on to, because those reputations are not very easy to establish, but they can be quite easily lost. So that was the primary thing that we wanted to hang on to. It was the quality of the thinking. I also said to them that this is an organisation where you will be a part of its future. We're a small organisation, we want everybody to contribute, and you will be listened to. And I think that one of the things that they felt, having been through a difficult period, is that there was quite a high degree of uncertainty, that communication wasn't as good as it could have been, and that they weren't really listened to, they were told. And they were told normally sometime after the rumours had begun. So I made it a priority for us to communicate as well as we possibly could do, internally as well as externally, and to listen to what it is that people have to say, because I was coming in new to the organisation, but I recognised that there were people that had been there for quite some time, and their ideas could be more valuable or just as valuable as my own. So I did not only listen to them, I took their ideas on board as well.
And did that change any of your strategy as a result? Did you flex the original thinking as a result of taking on those ideas?
It reminded me of the amount of work and effort that had gone into the things that had been accomplished and what we were good at. So it did, actually, to some degree. But having said that, in the end, if you're leading the organisation, one of the things you need to do is have a very clear vision. And so while I did take people's comments into consideration, in the end I had to make the decision about the direction in which we were heading.
Okay. So in my eyes, you've innovated within this organisation. And we're going to talk a moment about how you are representative of the changes that are going on in the industry that you're part of, and indeed a significant part of. How do you define within these works, how do you define and characterise innovation here?
Well, I haven't spent a lot of time considering how to define it, because I get on and do it, and I think it's about thinking creatively and not being afraid to do things differently. And an innovation can be employing somebody in a different kind of a role, or it can be borrowing or developing an idea from somewhere else, or it can be thinking up an idea in the shower that's completely fresh. It can come from anywhere. I think it's, for me, it's an attitude of mind. And I really enjoy and get pleasure from doing new things and innovating with the things that we have, and saying, just because something hasn't been done before, that's not a reason for not doing it, or just because something, other people haven't done something doesn't mean you shouldn't try it. And, or we did, as you kindly said, have a really excellent, I think, conference yesterday. But we have to innovate, and you do have to innovate to survive, because like anything, whether it's a relationship or a brand or a person, you need to be growing and developing. You cannot stand still. And I think particularly in the current climate, you have to innovate, not just, I mean, it's a fine line between being ahead of the curve and being seen to lead, and being behind the curve and being seen to be a laggard that's actually behind everybody else and slowing things down. And I'm determined that we are ahead of the curve. And I think it's a very energising thing to innovate, and it's something, also what I think is good about innovation is it's completely democratic. It can come from anywhere. And I think it's being alert to that.
And that there's two things there. There is democracy of innovation, and it absolutely can come from anywhere. Not everybody knows how to articulate their great ideas. So the challenge for any organisation, and I think probably even more so in a small organisation where people work closely together, is actually creating an environment where the ideas can come to the fore, and there's different ways of bringing those ideas to the fore. How do you approach that within these works, to give the space to your team's ideas?
Well, one is we meet regularly.
Yeah.
And we had an away day, a very good away day, which I think was quite seminal in the way in which we think and relate. And creating a culture which is a yes and rather than a no but. And I do think that's important, which is that you've got to create an environment in which people are sufficiently comfortable and confident to raise an idea. And even if that idea is a half idea, what you need to have, I think, is an organisation where it's a bit like, you know, being on a football team or a rugby team where other people are ready to catch the ball for you, and you feel that people are on your side, so that you are able to say things without being laughed at or shot down. And I've tried to create an environment where that can happen. So people also, it's delegating responsibility, giving people responsibility for particular areas. And you know, we recently hired 2 graduates, and the process for recruiting them and providing them with tests and the initial interviews were done by the most junior people in our organisation, who had a sense of what their working day was going to be like, who were much closer to their age, and they did a really good job in whittling it down to a short list. And then I saw the people when it had been whittled down to a short list, and it worked really well. And so they created a process. So for them it was a new thing, and we did things differently because of the approach that they took.
Okay. So I suppose another part of that question, and that's very much around, if you've got innovation, how are you rewarding it? How do people know that that new way of working, or that new way of contributing ideas or supporting each other's ideas is actually the right thing to do, and they feel the benefit of that?
Well, I think what most people respond to really well is proper appreciation, verbal appreciation, a thank you, which
to move to collaboration. How are you influencing that shift? How are you making people?
Well, I mean, the first thing that I did was identify the problem. When I discussed taking on this role, I said to the members of the board that this industry is perceived as dull and old-fashioned and divided, and that needs to change. needs to change because the price of not changing is too high, as well as the benefits that could be accrued by working collaboratively. And at the time, they accepted that intellectually, buying into it emotionally when the rivalry is so deep comes later. So the first thing is to acknowledge the problem, and then when I arrived, I interviewed about 65 people in my first few weeks. There were people that controlled over £6 billion of advertising investment. These were the people that were making the decisions about where the money goes. And I talked to them about their perceptions of the industry. And they reflected that, those feelings that I had, is that it's a very divided industry. And they no longer had the time to talk to the individual newspaper companies. And they no longer really had the interest in talking to those newspaper companies because the climate around them had changed so much. It felt like all of the interesting, sexy stuff was taking place elsewhere. They would be interested in a meeting with Facebook or with Twitter or with Google in a way that they were not interested in taking a meeting with a newspaper group. They felt that they knew what was going to come. And when the newspaper groups started to talk about the newer digital innovations that they were responsible for, one of them described it, said it was like Dad at the disco. You know, it was embarrassing, and it was unrelated to what the other groups were doing. So the first thing was to get them to acknowledge that there was a problem.
And having got to the point where you've acknowledged there's a problem, you then have to get people past some of those problems. There would have been some risk for you involved in that, or did it feel risky at the time?
Well, there is risk involved in it. The risk is that they don't really buy into it, that there's not a real willingness to change, and there's a questioning of whether it's an achievable strategy or even the right strategy. So that's the risk. But for me, that, as far as I was concerned, was what I was there for. So there's no alternative. It's a very difficult group to manage. We represent 6 highly competitive newspaper groups, which is a small enough number to get around one table, and you can look them in the eye, and they can look one another in the eye. But it means that it's a large enough number for 1 or 2 of them always to feel perhaps 1 or 2 of them may take longer to get with the programme than others. So it's a challenge. One of the things that I think has helped is I suggested that it would be a good idea for us to have an independent chairman. Because as an organisation, with having the 6 newspaper groups and me, I play an interesting role because I am part leader and part servant. I need to make sure that they are happy, but I also need to make sure that they're happy in my leadership. I need to lead them and enable them to do things that they could not do on their own. Until I arrived, the NMA and Newsworks in its early months had always had the tradition of having one of the people from the board from one of the newspaper groups chairing the organisation. What that means is there is an inherent conflict of interest because you are wearing 2 hats. On the one hand, you're representing, for the sake of argument, News International or Associated, and on the other hand, you're trying to do what's best for the industry. Those aren't always exactly the same things. So I felt very strongly that the Newsworks could achieve what we are here for more effectively with an independent chair. And in January of this year, we appointed David Patterson as our first independent chair.
It's very male.
Of course it matters. I would much prefer a more balanced board, a more diverse board, not just with women actually, but I would welcome that. So we are limited in that way, and I think it changes the dynamic to have men and women sitting around the table. We have actually got one non-executive woman board member, but that's not enough really.
Yeah.
But you can't manufacture it.
No.
But I would like that. We also have a mixture around our board of commercial people and marketing people. And I think that the more perspectives one can get, the better. If you wanted to make change within an organisation, you don't just want to see it from one perspective, you need to see it from several. And I think that we could perhaps have a bit more variety in that respect as well, if we want to get the best that we can do. But not everything happens around the boardroom table. A lot of the work goes on outside that, in fact, most of it. And we can have forums, and we do have forums where people get together, whether it's the heads of research or other sort of specialists that get together and discuss and contribute and innovate, and it all feeds into the process and what we do and our thinking.
Okay. I'm not going to push you much further. I promise you one more question, just to round up. Yesterday, your new chairman rounded up a brilliant session, and he summarised what had been talked about through the day. And one of the points he made was there's a lot to be done. So for News Works, if you were to say the next big thing, important thing for you to do, what would that be?
Well, I feel we are now on the front foot much more than we were before. And the important thing is that we capitalise on that. And one of the things that is always surprising is how often you have to repeat the messages. So I don't feel complacent about job done at all. I feel that we've had a successful milestone, but that we will need to repeat those messages and to replicate that feeling again and again and again. We also need to not just talk, we need to do, and there are some specific projects that we are involved with and will become involved with, which are central to what the industry needs to achieve. One of them is a piece of research that David referred to, which is called Tech Nation, and we're all geeks now, and it's looking at the way in which people think about technology and consume technology, and the fact that age is not the definer, and actually your disposable income is much less of a definer than you might think. It's to do with your interests, but all of us are geeks now. My mother has got an iPad, and it's inconceivable now that you're going to find somebody that has no technology at all in the UK. Everybody has something. So we're doing a piece of research on that. Two things came up yesterday which we are exploring. One of them is we are helping the industry work together in look at the efficiencies of the buying and selling process. And that's a fundamental issue for the industry, because we are a more cumbersome and wasteful and confusing process than we need to be. So there are improvements that can be made there, and I think our role there is to, at the beginning of the process actually, is to get people to come to the table together, because as an industry, if we work together, we can achieve much more. Another initiative that we are exploring is this issue of audience research. It's become much more complicated. So if you want to find out how many people are reading a news brand across all of its platforms, that's not a simple thing anymore. So that's another area that we are looking at. So the important thing for us is that we are changing the climate, we're changing perceptions, but we're also doing research, and we're useful in a practical way. And that's a never-ending thing. Those are some of the projects that we are going to be sort of focusing on from now.
Thank you, Rufus.
My pleasure.
It's been really helpful. Thank you. I'm going to turn our machine off now.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.